Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of our weekly Exploring the Parasha class with Rabbi Rebecca Schatz and Rabbi Matt Shapiro.
We are going to be talking about Parashat Vaetchanan today, which those of you who studied with me yesterday know that this is a parsha that you probably know actually very well, but don't know that you know very well. So the second recitation of the Ten Commandments is in this week's Parsha, as well as the Shema. So we are not going to look at either of those pieces, and I'm going to let Rabbi Shapiro introduce the verse that we are looking at. But I just wanted you to know that those two pieces are here in this week's Parsha. And the most interesting piece, and we talked a little bit about this last week, the most interesting piece of Deuteronomy in general is that we get certain things for the first time, but a lot of things we're getting for a second time through Moses' eyes. And if you look in the Ten Commandments in this week's Parsha, you'll see some differences. You'll see the difference in the way that that Shabbat is spoken about and the way that parents are spoken about, just as two examples. Also, the way that that God is seen as one God, there's a little bit more detail as to what that means. So interesting to just look at that. If you want to see the comparisons between the two, you can probably also just Google the two different sets of the Ten Commandments and see the differences. But if you wanted to look, they are in this week's Parsha. But I'll let Rabbi Shapiro talk to us about the actual part of our Parsha that we are going to be looking at.
As we have often done in this class, we're not going to be focusing in on the greatest hits piece so much. And there was one piece that caught Rabbi Schatz's eye that led to a semi-coherent rant from me. And she said, "Oh, good, we'll talk about that."
It was not coherent. It was just
completely incoherent. Yeah, I'm glad I've strayed all the way back.
But he was very passionate about it, and so it seemed like a good thing for us to teach. So
okay, maybe I'll be coherent today. There's a first time for everything. So we are here. We're still in sort of the general framework part of the speech. We talked last week about the larger structure of Dvarim and how it's like Moses' farewell, and he's still here talking like generally about like the teaching and the larger construct of like Torah and tradition and an experience of God. So we're beginning chapter 4. Israel, give heed to the laws and rules that I am instructing you to observe so that you may live to enter and occupy the land that the Lord, the God of your fathers, is giving you. So here he's talking about like why are we doing this, right? Why should we heed the laws and rules so that you can live, right? So that it's a source of life, which we will see a more well-known framing of that in a moment, and also to be able to enter into the land. Because again, the narrative framework for this, and we talked about this a bit last week as well, that it was given when we were on the other side of the river, right? Implying that it happened in the past, but it's still Moses' farewell speech on the east side of the Jordan. Why do we have these rules? To live and so that we can enter the land. I'll also call attention here to this phrase "hukim" and "mishpatim," which are often offered up as like the laws that we have from the Torah without a given reason, and the laws that we have in the Torah that do have a specific reason. That's a tease for the verse we're going to be looking at in a moment. You shall not add anything to what I command you, or take anything away from it, but keep the commandments of the Lord your God that I enjoin upon you. And we referenced this verse last week as well. It's a very recursive conversation we're having. We were talking last week about how it's a retelling of certain parts of the Torah, and this week we're starting by talking about what we talked about last week as we talk about retelling what happened in the Torah. But particularly interesting, this line, since in Dvarim, as Rabbi Schatz just indicated, in terms of this week's telling, as it were, of the Ten Commandments, they're slightly different. So it's just interesting that in a book that is a bit of a midrash itself, it's saying don't add anything and also don't take anything away. You saw with your own eyes what God did in the battle of Baal Peor, that God wiped out from you every person who followed Baal Peor. Idolatry is a bad idea. while you who held fast to the Lord your God are all alive today. Or as you might recognize from the Torah service, that before the, Rabbi Schatz is always happy when I sing, that this is the line that we say right before we read from the Torah as a part of our services, right? And understandable thematically, everyone who has been connected with God, you are all alive today. There's some fascinating theology in there that we are not going to get into that I think is a little tricky. I've imparted to you laws and rules, again, chukim umishpatim, as the Lord my God has commanded me, for you to abide in the land that you are about to enter and occupy. Okay, now here we are getting to the verse. Just one verse. Rabbi Schatz, it's the second straight week that we are only talking about one verse. What does that mean?
Well, it's also, there's not really so much, like the context before and after doesn't really like help this verse. So there's no reason to do the verses around it.
Oh, really? I actually think I think it's interesting. Well, I disagree. I think it's interesting because those pieces I think I knew, but this piece in terms of why we keep Torah seems to be indicating a very different way of thinking about it. Okay, verse 6, chapter 4. Here we go. Ushmartem va'asitem, you should, and the translation here, as it was last week, flattens it out. Translated says, observe them faithfully, but I would say you should
keep them and do them.
Guard them and do them, right? Not shamor v'zachor, but guard them and do them, observe them and do them. These ki chochmatchem uvinatchem. For they are your wisdom and discernment, le'enei ha'amim, to the before the eyes of the other nations, asher yishma'un et kol hachukim ha'ela, that will hear about all of these laws, all of these statutes. Ve'amru, rak am chacham v'navon hagoy hagadol hazeh, that they will then say, only a wise and great, only a wise and, I don't know, chacham v'navon. How would you differently translate? Only a truly wise and discerning, great people is this, right? It's when you keep the mitzvot, the other nations will look at us and say, gosh, golly gee, those Jews sure know what's up. Is my translation into the vernacular.
Can you make it a little bit bigger, do you think?
I have a hard time doing that on my...
Go to the top where the M is in the top right.
For map.
Go to the 3 dots.
Yep.
Now zoom into...
Zoom! Rabbi Schatz, master of Zoom and master of Zoom. Master of zooming over Zoom.
There you go.
Okay, Rabbi Schatz, I'm going to stop talking.
Okay. Are you sure? Okay. Any kushiot on this verse? It's clearly a verse that begs question, and also a deepening, as Rabbi Shapiro just did, but a deepening of translation in terms of what some of these words could mean, even though they are translated for us in one particular way below. Yeah, Renee.
Well, how will observing it be proof of their wisdom?
Great.
And then I have a comment too. It seemed to me that just based on all the other stuff that we were reading, that Rabbi Shapiro was reading prior, that Moshe Rabbeinu really has an incredible amount of strength, because in spite of the fact that he knows that he's not going to see the land, he's still able to convince them that the people that they still need to, that it's worth their while to keep all the mitzvot and all the other things that he's telling them. I mean, that's pretty incredible to me.
Yeah, great. So maybe to Rabbi Shapiro's point, like the verses before maybe do help us understand this piece a little bit more, and maybe at least, if I'm understanding what you're saying clearly, at least how Moshe felt that which he was seeing, and then obviously for us writing down that came before this verse, how that, trickles down into becoming something that we have to hold on to understand this particular verse.
Right, like what you were talking about yesterday, how what we get from our previous generations.
Right. Yeah, which is 3 verses later. Yesterday I taught in my Midrashah class, chapter 4, verse 9. So there's, it's interesting to see how those two things play together if you were with me yesterday. Okay, I'll go in order of hands. Joanna, Nancy, then Elon.
2 things.
Yeah.
One is all these words for wisdom, and then just following in the verse also how they kind of parallel or don't each other, right? So the mitzvot somehow have chokhmah in them, and then therefore you will be an am chacham.
Yeah.
The mitzvot somehow have bina in them, and then you will be navon. So we've got 3 different words for like smart here or wise. And there's obviously a nuance there. How do we get at that? And then like in one case, they're parallel and in another case, they're not.
Beautiful.
Of all the possible reasons that you could give for observing God's mitzvot, I would think like what the other nations think of us should not really factor into why we're observing God's mitzvot. What's this business about being concerned about what other people will think of us?
Great. 2 very beautiful and poignant points. And I think those are the first point I did not think of at all. And I love, and interestingly, this is now the 3rd verse of Deuteronomy that someone has made a similar claim about the words being used more poetically than they are in the other 4 books of the Torah, in such a way that they are mirrors almost of themselves, right? Being used in different forms. Vered Hopenstand yesterday mentioned how the different binyanim, the different conjugations of the word are now making that same root mean 2 separate things, and yet they're both helpful to the meaning of the verse. Interestingly, for those of you who are with us for Tisha B'Av, we focused on a verse that does exactly that. Hashivenu Adonai Elecha V'Nashuva, right? And then Chadesh Yameinu Kekedem. Though Chadesh Yameinu is not the same root as Kekedem, they're also mirrors of one another in terms of the new and the old. Rabbi David Kasher and I found that there is a word in grammar for that. It's a contonym. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? No? Okay. Anyway, great. I'll put it in the chat in a second so you can read it. Okay, Nancy.
Well, I also thought like Joanna about that last part of it, about like, why do we care? But listening to the other verses actually struck me in all these verses. It seems to me there's a lot of carrot and stick, right? Like those people were struck down, you weren't. And then, all these reasons for abiding by these laws. And then here, although I'm not sure that the argument is that strong, but, you follow them faithfully and the whole rest of the world will think you're really smart. So it just seems like a lot of, smiting you is the, stick. And then there's all these carrots to help you want to follow these laws.
Yeah. And to your point and to Joanna's point, why does that even matter, right? Why does it matter why shouldn't we just want to observe Torah because it's meaningful to us? Why should we need that, incentive to make us want to do these things or not guilt, but I don't know what the word would be. Oh, my dad is here. Hold on 1 second. Rabbi Shapiro, just take it away. Hold on 1 second.
Hi, Moradale. Bye, Moradale.
I think the other part is fear, right? Hey, those other people are not alive anymore. So it's sort of like, why do you need the fear also in order to make you want to follow the laws?
Right. I mean, I would flip around Rabbi Shabbat's question completely. I mean, I think by nature, and we hear all the time about how we are a stiff-necked people, what's an effective incentive, right? How do we actually keep folks on the straight and narrow, right? Moshe is saying goodbye. I think he's kind of casting about, trying to figure out how to get us to keep doing the things he hopes we're going to do. And I agree, this was, I think, a big part of what caught our collective rabbinic eye in terms of how interesting it is that the argument is you should observe these faithfully so that other people will see how awesome you are is a fascinating one. Ilan.
I was going to bring the same point up, and I would say that actually, if in fact this was the reasoning, it hasn't worked pretty well. It hasn't really worked that well, because surely that great nation is a wise and discerning people has led us to getting our asses kicked for 2,000 years. So to do it to please other people really didn't work that well for us. We should have been doing it because it was the right thing to do.
Yeah, for sure.
Rabbi Schatz, you're back.
Hi. I just had to. I got a new coffee table. My dad came to see if I needed a drill before he goes all the way home, and then he would bring the drill back. So he's here in the background.
Love Moradale.
Yes, we all love Moradale. Okay. And here he comes. Okay. Anyway, wait, Dad. Let me just answer Elon really quickly.
Hi, Moradale.
So I think that one of the things also that Elon's getting at is that if we had maybe even more confidence or more connection to what those laws and those practices were, we wouldn't have even needed to worry about whether or not the nations around us cared. So I think that to your last point of we should have just wanted to do them and been connected to them. I then wonder if the question to those people were, did you understand why you were doing them, or what the purpose was for those chukim and mishpatim, right? For those laws and for those understandings, because if you didn't understand them, then you might not feel any connection to them. And then you are comparing yourselves outwardly because you want to know why these other people around you aren't doing something that you also don't find connection with. So that's a little bit coming from me, a little bit more of a meta question in terms of what did the people even feel connected to in that time? And is that why there was this comparison?
Well, it's particularly interesting to me since we saw parallel construction in a few of these verses before this one. We saw chukimu mishpatim, I think 2 different times. I think it's really interesting that here it says just the chukim, which of the categories, right? The paradigmatic example of a chok is para aduma. Why do we do para aduma? I don't know, because it says so in the Torah, right? There are lots of mitzvot that are given that are more in the category of mishpatim, that there seems to be a reason given for them, but there are chukim that it just sort of says, hey, this is what you do. So I think it's particularly interesting, this verse. I found 1 or 2 pieces. I don't know that I found a satisfying response to it, but I think it's interesting that is the category. I would think the verse would make more sense if it said kol hamishpatim ha'ela rather than kol hachukim ha'ela.
Yeah, that's a good point. Joanna.
So in our discussion so far, we keep talking about the laws in the plural. We're using words these, the chukim, the mishpatim, and yet it says in the verse, ki hi chochmatchem, that because one thing, singular, right? So are we just inferring here that the references to the Torah, because in the Torah itself also, in the verse before and in this verse, it's referring to plural. And even in our verse, right, it says kol hachukim ha'eleh, plural, all of these laws, and yet here is the singular pronoun. So, we can kind of infer that the singular is a reference to the singularity of all of the Torah is one thing, but, or is there some significance to the particular thing that is going to bring chokhmah and bina?
That's great. Based on some of the commentaries that I found, some of the ones that got Rabbi Shapiro really going, so I'm excited to have him share them with you. It seems to be that the singularity here is around a certain topic, which the way that you said it, I actually appreciated much more than the way that the commentators have kind of ascribed that one topic to being what the chokhmah and the bina was. But I love the drash around whether this is the full Torah, right? Like kind of grasping everything to be able to then find the chokhmah and bina in that. Or is it, and this wouldn't grammatically necessarily work, so this is where, a drash would come into play. Is it that it's a singular people, right? That in order to find that chokhmah and bina, you actually have to find the communal aspect of everybody finding that guarding and that the shamor and the asitem, right? The doing and also the keeping together as one community to then be able to find that chokhmah and bina. But yes, thank you for pointing out those different pieces. Okay, Renee, and then we're going to move on to commentaries.
But there's also, from like what we talked about before, that amongst the more right-wing from people, that we should just accept the fact that we have to do these commandments and listen to them. Right. And it's not our job to challenge anything. We just are supposed to observe and zeal, because that's what God has commanded.
Sure. I mean, I think that's hard, obviously, in terms of like how we practice, right. we the community of Tom Beth Am practice our Judaism, but also I think for these people, right, going into a land without their leader, to go back to last week's class, right, the fact that they are going to have to know what to do and how to put it to use without someone saying, and this is how, right, there needs to be, going back to part of what Elon said, there needs to be some feeling and some connection, not just you were told to do this, so you should now do this, right? Anybody knows that if you tell, for example, a conversion student, if you say, before you convert, you need to keep kosher and you need to keep Shabbat. Okay, well, the first few weeks, they're going to be able to do those things, even if there's no meaning behind it, because it's like doing a homework assignment, right? I'm going to mark all these things off of a checklist and make sure that I do all the right things. But unless they find connection in those parts of their existence, right, of their Jewish identity, they're not going to continue to keep kosher and they're not going to continue to keep Shabbat, because that connection will have gone away. So the knowing that you have to do it, right, which I put in quotes because what does that really even mean either? That isn't enough, right? Both for the people, but also for us in the 21st century, in order to know what it is that we need to hold on to for our own Judaism.
I mean, I think that's true for the people who are converting, you, because you work with 8,000 conversion students, but even those of us who get one or two once in a while. I mean, I think that's true for the folks who you work with. But that's
what I'm saying. Yeah.
But there are also people in the world, like there are people who join communities and they're told what to do and they say okay and they do it, right? Like not everyone, in some ways, I mean, the movement or the community you join, I think, is as much like your sort of temperament and like your worldview as it is anything else, right? There are definitely people who just want to be told what to do. And you tell them to keep kosher, you tell them to keep Shabbat, you tell them to vote a certain way, you tell them to, whatever it is, that they say, okay, thank you for telling me what to do. Right. There are plenty of those folks as well. They are not often the people who will work with one of the rabbis at Temple Beth Am to go through the conversion process, but there are plenty of those people out there, plenty of those Jews out there.
Totally. And I think that, I mean, part of the challenge, now this is like a completely different class, so we'll get back to the topic in 1 second, but
I'm doing my job.
Part of some of the, I don't know, angst maybe? I don't, tension, that's a better word.
Angst.
Okay. Part of some of the tension, I think, with the conservative movement is just that, right? That there are certain things that we want to say, but this is halacha, and yes, we've now found connection to it, but that's why we're going to do it. And then you walk into a liberal modern experience and you think to yourself, wait a second, I now feel like this is something I should be doing, but also it's limiting me to be able to experience X, Y, or Z. So I totally agree with you. And I think that within, like, I'll just speak for myself, like within my own Jewish practice, there are those moments of like, well, I know what to do, so just tell me what to do. Oh, but wait, that's going to be hard for me to do in the practice of my actual life. So I need to find connection to it so that I know that it's something that I'm not just doing because I'm being told to, but rather because I actually have feeling around it.
I have a really hard time with, maybe this is why you get more conversions and I have more angst around it. The word of the day is angst.
No, contronym is the word of the day.
It's angst. I want to be welcoming. I think we benefit from people who are drawn to Judaism, who care about Judaism, who join the Jewish people. I think in general that is a good thing. And I love that we are welcoming and we find ways to let people in and we find ways to help people find meaning. And I have been on more than one Beit Din, often with people who I have brought forth as conversion candidates, where people have said things like, I just love about Judaism that you can come and you can find your meaning with it and you don't get told too much what to do and you can just really like, and it's like, not really, right? And that's how it's been presented to them, is that we want you to find meaning and we want you to find connection. And it's, that's very personal. And that's true. And there are still normative standards for what it is. And that's a very difficult dance. I have a really hard time with that. I have not yet found a way to navigate that successfully, but Rabbi Shabbat's probably have.
Okay.
Right?
We could talk about conversion for a long time, but I think at least with the students that I work with, one of the things that's most important to me is knowing where they are now, but knowing also where they want to go, because those chukim and mishpatim, again, back to Elon's point, are only going to sit well with them and continue to be part of their Jewish identity if they can actually tell me where they are now, but also like what the steps are for them to want to either do more or experience more or feel more connected, right? I mean, it took me until rabbinical school to find a connection to tefillin. And it was something that I was on a journey to do for a long time. I don't expect my conversion students necessarily to find that, especially female conversion students, to find that connection that quickly. And it's something that if they start to think about ritual objects, that maybe they will find that connection and find themselves practicing those things later on down the line. So I think a lot of it has to do with just education and experience and exposure to then want to do those things. Okay. So though this is tangentially related, why don't we get back to the verse, and why don't you go, because your rant is longer than anything I'm going to say.
I don't want to do that rant again. I mean, I found other stuff. You can.
All right, go ahead.
I only vaguely remember what the rant was about.
2 days ago.
I know, a lot has happened in 2 days. I found there are two different places in the Talmud where this verse is cited, and they seem to be presenting very different ways about thinking about how Jews relate to other nations. So I think it's interesting to sort of juxtapose them one with the other, and then maybe Rabbi Schatz will cue me up for a rant, or she can rant. Rabbi Schatz, how come you never rant?
I think that's like that's a big question that we probably don't have to go into right now.
Okay. So I think it's fair to say that the general rabbinic worldview is mixed on how Jews should relate to the other nations. That might be the nicest possible way of saying it. So particularly when it comes to this verse, there are different ways of reflecting on, well, what does this say about how we should be interacting with the other nations? One of them actually presents a fairly I would say I think positive way of reflecting on this. And the Gemara asked the question, on our verse in terms of this idea of chokhmatchem and binatchem. What is your chokhmah and binah that the other nations are going to be impressed by? And it answers its own rhetorical question. This is the calculation of astronomical seasons and the movement of constellations as the calculation of experts is witnessed by all. Right? So there is a wisdom that we, the Jewish people, have learned that isn't just applicable for us, but it's actually helpful for everyone. And so what is that? It's our astronomical expertise, and that then is what we should transmit out into the other nations. So I just thought that was an interesting piece in terms of thinking about this sense of how do we relate to the other nations of the world? What might we have to offer? Because, well, they're probably not going to follow the ritual of the red heifer necessarily. So I thought it was interesting to see that, sort of very specific reading of what that chokhmah that we're meant to transmit is. So that's on the sort of like playing nice with others end of the spectrum. And on the other hand, in Masechet Avodah Zarah, no one picked up on this specific wording too much. But at the beginning of the verse when it says le'enei ha'amim, like in front of the eyes of the other nations, what is that? And like, why does it say enei ha'amim? Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi says, all of the mitzvot that the Jewish people perform in this world will come and strike the faces of the nations of the world in the world to come.
I saw that and I was like, I really hope that Rabbi Shapiro understands anything that is saying.
Oh, no. I mean, I think it's like, I think he's playing with...
The Einei part. He's playing with the...
Correct. With what's going on here, right? Le'enei ha'amim. Why does it say dafka le'enei ha'amim? Because of course that in the world to come, the mitzvot of the Jews are going to come and smack the other nations of the world right in the eye. Haha, we were right and you were wrong.
But what does that mean? Does that mean that in the world to come, that everybody who's not Jewish is now going to see that our mitzvot were correct and now they're going to start following them?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a big part of Jewish eschatology.
Yeah, I don't like that.
I mean, I'm not saying I like it, or I think Elon is pulling his non-hair out over there. But I'm not saying I like it. I just think it's interesting to see those two pieces from Talmud juxtaposed with each other.
Yeah.
Right? That these are reasonably contemporaneous teachings. Those are the two places in the Talmud where this verse shows up. On the one hand, haha, we're right, you're wrong. On the other hand, we have something to offer and we're going to share it.
Yeah.
Without judgment, right? Without we're right and you're wrong. So I think it's just interesting to see those two pieces sort of set up next to each other. I'm not saying I like the second piece, but it's definitely interesting. Denise and then Renee.
So just thinking about the astronomical part, so first it just kind of jumped out at me because in archaeology, like a lot of the ancient people were really, really interested in astronomy and solstice and all this kind of stuff. And now, like when modern scholars look at these ancient societies, that's one of the things that makes those people get taken seriously as people. So like even in Tonga, they have this like solstice thing and everything. Oh, wow, they were so advanced and so intellectual and blah, blah, blah. And the societies where we don't have those records, they're not always looked upon. They're looked upon almost like second tier intellectually. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Like it just sort of puts us on that world stage.
Totally.
But then also like in this next part that we were talking about of, everyone's going to see we were right or whatever. Maybe just like thinking about specifically the astronomy part, it's sort of like Hashem Echad, like there's no disagreement. Like whatever they figured out in Tonga is the same thing they figured out in northern England and in the Maya Peninsula, because like the sun is the sun and it's there. And so maybe it's referring to just everyone's going to be sort of clear that there's one reality in the world and we can all be there together.
Yeah, I think when it comes to, the way that our tradition thinks about the end of days, right? When we think about the eschatology that we have, it's pretty clear that there is a sense that there will be a collection of all of the nations, and we will all recognize the oneness of God, and then we'll go from there. There is some question about like how harmonious or how aggressive that experience will be, right? It's pretty consistent in terms of the messaging that like there's a version of that that's going to happen. And sometimes it's a sense of much more kumbaya-y, and sometimes it's a sense of there's really going to be some tush kicking that goes down in order to get there. So I agree that like, yeah, there's going to be that recognition, and Vayomahu Yadonai Echad U'Shmo Echad, right? Like that's what's going to go down. But there is some question about like how much conflict there's going to be to get there. And this piece from the Gemara seems to be pretty chazak in terms of its sense of how that's all going to go down.
Renee.
So I was just curious as to if, based on what you said earlier, does that mean that the other nations will assume that, in order for them to get whatever, they're going to have to like convert and be like the Jews?
The sense that I got from that passage was that, that there's going to be like some real contrition and, oh my God, we can't believe we didn't see this before. And now we're going to, hop on board the Jewish party train is my sense of it. Rabbi Schatz hated it so much she left the class entirely. Yeah, Elon.
So it seems curious that we would aspire to everyone observing the same rituals that we do. It's not foreign to my understanding that we would want everyone to observe kind of the basic Noahic laws, right? Don't kill, don't steal, those kind of things. That's certainly part of our tradition. It seems odd that in that interpretation says not only do we want them to observe those things, but we want them to observe the minutia as well. That's the part I'm uncomfortable with, and once again, it doesn't seem relevant to us, meaning that we should do it because we want to do it. And if the other people look at us and say, wow, this is a good example, we would like to do it as well, great, but that should not be what drives us. And the other point I'd like to make is the Einayim thing kind of reminds me of the Morris Iron concept, which is if you eat a Impossible Burger you shouldn't eat an Impossible Burger with a piece of cheese on it, because somebody might walk by and say, oh, I know that Elon keeps kosher and he's eating a hamburger, he's eating a cheeseburger, that must be okay. Once again, I don't hold to that because I actually don't particularly care what anyone else thinks, right? So,
yeah, I will say this about the passage in the Gemara. I mean, we don't paskin by the Gemara, right? It's not necessary. Just because something is said in the Gemara, that doesn't mean that it's held up as like the normative standard, right? This is one rabbi's opinion in Talmud. It's recorded. There isn't much on it that gets drawn specifically out from there. And it is interesting to see. It's definitely we don't hear much more from that rabbi in terms of then, therefore, what are the expected mitzvot that all of the other nations of the world will follow? And is it meant to be they're going to hit them in the face, and that sort of has they'll realize they were wrong, and that will be shameful to them, or it'll hit them in the face, and then therefore they should keep all of the mitzvot. That it isn't clear from there. There isn't much more on it, but it is an interesting passage. Ilan, I'm glad you brought up the Marit Ayin piece, and I think very well explained, and thank you for that. I have a really hard time with that. I think performative Judaism is very, very tricky, right? How do you know when you should do something just because you don't want someone to see you doing something that they might think that you would be doing, but it's not what you're doing, but you want to make sure that they don't even think that you might have done that thing. It's really tricky. And I'll just say personally, as someone who, made the choice even as like a teenager to keep wearing his kippah going to public high school, developed some fascinating neuroses around what Ma'arit Ayin would entail, just trying to grow up and be a person, right? But oh my God, what if people see me doing that, and what will that mean? Exhausting. I don't know. Rabbi Schatz, what do you think? I wonder what Rabbi Schatz thinks about Ma'arit Ayin.
About Ma'arit Ayin? I think it's tricky. I think it's something that we as rabbis, which I hate kind of like using us as a different category, because I don't think that in many ways we are. This is one that I just can't speak for any other profession, but
Rabbi Schatz is saying she thinks she's better than everybody.
Yeah, that is exactly what I just said. But that Rabbi Artson, I remember when we started rabbinical school, Rabbi Artson said, from this day forward, you are going to be seen as a rabbi, even though, I hadn't even taken my first class yet. I was sitting in the Beit Midrash, for orientation. And you don't believe that until you're actually out of rabbinical school and you walk into the grocery store and someone wants to talk to you about the sermon you just gave, and you're in the grocery store after you worked out, you're sweaty and gross, you're a person. So you went to the grocery store after you did all these other things. And then you realize that doesn't change no matter where you are. And so that Ma'arit Ayin piece, I think about it every time I leave my house, right? That what am I buying at a grocery store? If someone were to see what I was buying, though I'm extremely comfortable with it in terms of kashrut, would someone else see something in my basket and think, are you allowed to eat that? Right? And that's not because of me, Rebecca Schatz. That's because of the title of rabbi. So I think and it goes maybe it's not vice versa, but it goes in the opposite direction of like, my wearing of tefillin, right? I talked about this a little bit right after we came back in person for Minyan. My wearing of tefillin is in some ways much more performative than I would like it to be, right? When I was davening at home alone behind a screen, I didn't often feel the interest or connection or need to put on tefillin. But when I'm at Beth Am, I would never think of not wearing tefillin, because in that setting, it's an important thing to our community and to me. So though that's not Ma'arit Ayin in the same way, there is this idea of like, how are other people seeing me, seeing us, and what do we do to make ourselves comfortable? I don't think it always has to do with what makes other people comfortable, but what makes us comfortable in front of other people. I
think it's a trick. I mean, it's woven throughout this whole beginning part of Dvarim in terms of like Moses is going away and he's trying to figure out what's the right message, right? It's like kind of almost a PR question. Like, what's the right messaging to get Bnei Yisrael to like keep them on track even after he's gone? Is it carrot? Is it stick? Is it be mindful of how other people are going to be looking at you? Is it because, Vatem had become that I got to sing again for Rabbi Schatz, right? Is it because it's life-giving to you, right? Like what is it, some of column A, some of column B, right? What's the right messaging to get us to do the things that will hold us together as a people? Which, if that was a question 3,000 years ago, it's certainly a question. It's certainly a question now.
And I think
I don't know that we've come up with a good answer yet, but it's tough.
I think also back to the point of, how do we do this for other people? Sometimes even within our own, again, I'll just speak for myself, but sometimes within our own kind of journeys of Judaism, we try out different kinds of Judaisms to figure out which one works best with us. And I know that when I was in college and I became much more involved with a much more Orthodox kind of community on campus, the fact that I had grown up, and I'm not just saying this because my dad can hear me, but the fact that I had grown up in a very vibrant, conservative Jewish household made it actually that much easier to be in that community because I still had a strong identity in who I was. So I could see the beauty in these other things that were going on around me, but there was never a fear of me saying, oh, well, let's try that because that looks so much better. And I feel the same about interfaith relations and looking to other religions to see what they do well, because if I see a Muslim community doing something really beautifully or a Christian community doing something really beautifully to bring in their members or to create community, why not try that out in a Jewish community, right? Why not try that at Temple Beth Am? I'm not asking to put a crucifix, in front of the ark or start taking on prayer customs like the Muslim community. But if there are certain...
That was in the original blueprints for the new sanctuary. Actually.
Right, yeah. But there are certain things that if you feel rooted in the identity that you have, looking outside can be a beautiful influence and doesn't have to just be something that you'd be nervous about in terms of assimilation, but can be a really beautiful way of looking to the outside to bring those things in. Yeah.
I think you snuck a really important revision of a word in there, which is Judaisms, right? And I think that the way that I think about different aspects of Jewish practice, theology, peoplehood is different now than it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and will hopefully be different 5 or 10 years ago from now. Not to mention, that the way the reasoning for why I keep kosher the way I keep kosher and keep Shabbat the way that I keep Shabbat and the way that I, do different things and understand different aspects of Judaism, those don't necessarily all line up cleanly together, right? Like there are different interpretations and understandings for all of those pieces that sort of get crunched together in a vaguely coherent way, hopefully some of the time, but it's not like my kashrut theology lines up with my Shabbat theology, lines up with my tefillah theology, right? Like, part of the reason I add in the imahot to my Amidah is not because I think it's like the right liturgical, there's as much a cultural reason for why I do that as there is like a specific liturgical understanding for why that still works, right? So I think opening it up in terms of thinking about the different ways and reasons why we do certain things, I think that's really important because it breaks it out of like a hermetically sealed box and leaves it much more open. It's more complicated because it's not just one thing, but I think it's important. Yeah, Alon.
Yeah, I would be disappointed if what drove people in observance is external perception, right? I hope that what I do because it's meaningful to me. And if it bothers somebody that I go to Smith & Wollensky's and have a piece of tuna because people think I'm kosher, I particularly don't care, right? Because that's what my comfort level, and that's what I feel that within my definition of kashrut, that's comfortable to me. And particularly with religious things, I can't really concern myself with other people's perceptions. It's not, and I think part of the problem with orthodoxy in many cases is that people do things because for appearance sake, as opposed to for true kavanah, right? What's really meaningful to them. And that's, the more I think about it, that's really what is disturbing about this particular verse is that it's encouraging you to do it for other people as opposed to for yourself.
I would take it even one step further than that. I completely agree. And the step that I would take is, at least for me, if I'm to go to an unhechshered restaurant, which I learned from Rabbi Aaron Alexander, not to say unkosher restaurant, because you can still eat something kosher at an unhechshered restaurant. But if I go to an unhechshered restaurant and I eat something that, as you just said, I'm very comfortable eating, that if someone were to see me eat that and wonder, I see that as a moment to be able to also teach around the possibility of kashrut in an unhechshered restaurant. So So all the more so that if I'm comfortable with it and I know why I'm comfortable with it and I can explain why I'm comfortable with it, then also I get to teach why it's okay to be comfortable with that. And maybe that also influences in a really beautiful way other people's Judaisms. To Elon specifically, the first time that I asked you about leaving before Musaf was a learning.
I was going to say something about that too.
Was a learning experience for me, right? It's something that you rightfully so feel very deeply about and have reasoning that is rooted in not just I feel like I can leave now, but really rooted in personal preference and learning and really Jewish education. And to then be able to have an answer, I think that's the most important part. Is if there's no answer, then what's the point in doing something outwardly that you might be comfortable with, but others might see as uncomfortable? The fact that you can share that with people, or I can share my tuna sandwich.
Rabbi Schatz, you maybe want to give, not everyone might know Elon's specific practice.
Oh, Elon can explain it. I don't need to explain it for him.
Yeah, so the one of the main parts of the Musaf service is discussing the return of animal sacrifice to the tradition, and given that that is not something that I aspire to, I find it it's not comfortable for me to pray for that, right? So I choose to get up and leave most of the time. There's sometimes I'll stay around if there's a specific reason, but it's just not. And even if one were to say, well, it's not really praying for return of animal sacrifice, it's only in a figurative sense for the restoration of the great temple in Jerusalem, that's not even something that I aspire to, because the only way to do that would be to blow up the Dome of the Rock, and I am not willing to blow up the Dome of the Rock and cause World War III in order to restore the temple. So there's no circumstance under which I'm comfortable with that concept.
You heard it here, folks. You heard it here first, folks. Elon Spar not in favor of starting World War III.
But also a really beautiful example of exactly what I was just trying to share, right? Like now you all learned something about a practice that otherwise you might just think, oh, Elon has lunch to get to, right? There's actual meaning behind it, and I agree that the perception of that which we do, as long as you're doing it intentionally, should be done without guilt and should be done so that if someone asks you, you can share it, and then that becomes even more education.
I think there's another piece here that we haven't named this whole time that I know we're I don't know if this will wrap things up, but I think it's important because Rabbi Schatz and I have both rabbied Vaetchanan, some of us more successfully than others. It kicked me out after a year. So, but Rabbi Schatz and I have each rabbied in Vaetchanan. And Elon, I remember very clearly, you came up to me at one point and you're like, just so you know, I'm not leaving after the Torah study because I didn't like something that you said, right? you made a point of coming up and saying like, here's why I usually leave for Musaf, right? So there was also a relational element there.
Exactly.
That I think is really, really important, right? That there's a recognition, this might read a certain way. This isn't why it is. I'm going to explain myself. And you did it very thoughtfully and kindly and intentionally, right? There was, and it actually built the relationship, right? That I understood where you were coming from more deeply after you and I had that conversation. And I think for me, one of the, if not the most challenging thing about the whole Ma'arit Ayin business is, wait, so I'm now supposed to put my head in the mindset of a potentially judgmental person who's watching me? Like, that's terrible. Like, that's a deeply neurotic way to walk around in the world. Instead of saying, I'm going to conduct myself in such a way that hopefully there's some openness to relationship building and conversation around the choices that I'm making. And to try to pull that back into the verse, maybe we can hope for some aspect of that, right? That when we look around, and Rabbi Schatz is speaking to this really nicely, when we look around and we see people of other faiths or other backgrounds or other Judaisms in terms of how they're doing things, that hopefully we can approach that with curiosity and openness to build relationships and see the wisdom in what they're doing rather than coming at it from a place of judgment, which we each have a tendency to as well, right? Like, oh, that person's doing that thing differently. Why are they making that choice, right? To try to course correct from that into a place of greater openness and curiosity, which is not always easy, but is really important.
I'll just add one last, that was a beautiful way of ending. So I want to just add this piece, which is a pitch actually for something that's coming up in, at Beth Am. But I think it's also the things that we don't do, right? It's not always just the things that we do, but the things that we don't do, and that we might have also reason behind those things. So at the beginning of my time at Beth Am, I think I taught on the fact that I don't cover my hair at all. I don't even do it when I'm in shul davening a service. And many people had questions about that, mostly because Cantor Chorney does. And because also in the conservative movement, many women choose to. And the fact that I don't, that's a thing I don't do. That's not a thing I do. That's a thing I don't do, but I have reason around it and can back it up. And everybody has things like that, right? Whether you're a woman who doesn't wear a tallis or you're someone who chooses to only eat in kosher restaurants. And so you have to have that boundary when you go to see congregant, right? Like there are different boundaries of things that we also just don't do that we need to explain. And the pitch is that I'm going to be, really facilitating, not teaching, learning, I should use that word, along with any woman who is interested about Hilchot Nida. And this is it's not a class that is going to teach you how to practice Nida. And it's not a class that's going to teach you why Nida is necessary, but really what are the reasons that our rabbis even created such a thing? And how is it seen as like a holy experience for women to be able to, understand, not necessarily embark on, but understand. So for women of anyone who's identifying as a woman and of any age and of any stage of life, again, this is not application of Hilchot Nida, it's just the learning of it. So if you're interested in that learning and where it comes from and the history and I would say beauty behind it, this is going to be a class on Sundays, every Sunday of August. So I hope that you will join us in that as well. And thank you, Rabbi Shapiro. This was a great conversation that you mostly led us through. So thank you for that. And Yasher Koach.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.